All right, so today I'm going to go over chapter 10 and probably chapter 11. Okay, I think what I'll do by the end of the period too is I'll give you the written tests for 10 and 11. Okay, all right, so this chapter is probably the shortest one in the book. They talk about how forms work. We're going to go through that very quickly. How to use jQuery to work with forms. Well, forms, anytime you click a submit button, this shouldn't be a surprise to you, a submit event takes place. All right, so you've got control over what you want to have happen. For instance, let's assume that you've got a very simple form, and that form in there has, I don't know, just a login and a password. And if you leave one of those blank, okay, if you leave one of those blank, even before you check them, you shouldn't go anywhere. Does that make sense? So you could use that prevent default that we talked about before to keep the user, on the page. All right, so we'll talk about how to use jQuery to work with forms, and then we'll look at this application. Understanding this application, in my opinion, for whatever it is or is not worth, will help you Tuesday of next week when you take the test. All right, so if we do finish 10 and 11 today, all right, it's on Tuesday. Now next week, Monday will be lab. Tuesday, we will take the test. Wednesday, we will go over chapter 12. That's the last chapter this semester that we're going over. All right? And after that, I probably will prepare some kind of pretest for you. But I think I'm going to make Thursday and Friday of next week both lab days, and then the following Monday, and we're in December already to my knowledge. All right? Let's see, that would be... So that's this week, that's next week, that's the 7th already. That's our last full week, because the week of the 14th, you're here Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and then that's it. I don't know what they're doing with us, because they usually have like a lunch for us, but I don't think they want to do that this year from what I heard. I don't really care. It doesn't matter to me. If they say, hey, there's no lunch, and you have to stay here in the morning and finish up your grades and everything else, and then you can go home, that's okay with Jeff. Okay. So, how forms work, again, we've talked about this before, but let's just take a look at the example that they give. Am I right in assuming that if I gave you literally 5 minutes that everybody in this room could write that form that you see on your screen? Would you agree with that? I sure would. All right? And I'm not talking CSS or anything. I don't care. But I'm just talking about making the form. Label, text box, label, text box, button. Period. There's the form. All right. Now, notice for the email address in here, all right, for both of these, they've got type equal text. That's not really written very well. If you were ever asked to do this on a test, you might want to say type equal email, because at a minimum, what that will do is that will force the system to go in and make sure that you've got a correctly formatted email. Not that it's a valid email. There's no way to do that, but that it's correctly formatted. So if you look on here, what you'll notice is, where do we have IDs? We have an ID for the form itself. We have an ID for the email address. Text box, we have an ID for the first name text box. We also have an ID for the button. So in other words, anything that's in there that you may want to be able to manipulate programmatically has an ID. Does that make sense to everyone? All right. And again, the action is what you want to have happen if the user clicks the submit button and everything that's in your program was okay. Since this is a get right here, remember there's two big things that you can have here, a get and a post. If it's a get, notice what gets sent. So here we put in judy@muroc.com. That's actually an email address because I talk with her all the time. All right. And first name Judy. So what's going to happen is it's going to call this file down here, join.php, and everything from the question mark on is known as the query string. And the query string is going to say email address, and it's going to be Judy. All right. And then it's got that 40, which I think is like a blank space that they're putting in between there. And then Muroc Judy, oh no, that's the @ sign. So it's Judy@Muroc.com. That's the first parameter that gets passed. Or the attribute is address, and the value is Judy@Muroc.com. And then there's first name, and that's Judy. Does that make sense? Again, when it is a get like that, everything shows right in the address line. You would not want to do that if what you were passing in was credit card information or password information or anything that you would consider to be of a sensitive nature. All right. It's even possible if all you were asking for was an email address, you might not want to make it a get, because then you're exposing email addresses. It just depends on a lot of things. All right. So again, that's what's passed. So the name, as it says, now the key thing in here, notice there's both an ID property and a name property. Everybody agree with that? This one doesn't have one, but this has ID name, ID name, ID name. Almost always, and really the exception is pretty much like when you're working with radio button groups, but most of the time the name and the ID are the same. The ID is what's used on the client side. That's the stuff we're doing this semester. The name is what's used on the server side. That's what you will do in fall of next year when you are taking the Node.js class. It's referring to the same piece of data, but what you're saying there is, who do you want to allow to manipulate it? The ID is manipulated by the client, by you. All right, the user, whatever you want to say. And the name is manipulated on the server side. Hopefully that makes at least a little bit of sense to you. All right. All right, the action again, as it says, it's the URL of the file that will process the data in the form. If you remember in the example that we went through in an earlier chapter, we had another HTML file. So when you press the button for that sign up, it just went to an HTML page that said success. That's not typically how it's done. But since we're not really working with a server right now, that's the way that we're doing it. I don't know if that even makes sense to you or not. But again, typically when you press that, it means send it out. This file would not be your file, join.php. That would be on a server someplace. All right, so if you were literally trying to do this to join an email list, it would be the email, a program or something for that particular website, for that company, whatever. All right, and then the method. Again, the default is get, so if you don't put anything in there, so if you left this off, but that's considered very poor practice. Not only that, a lot of times you'll see the words get and post fully capitalized. It doesn't matter. You can put get in lowercase, uppercase, mixed case, same with post. But a lot of times I'm just telling it because you'll see it like that get and or post are fully capitalized. All right. So as it says, you know what a form is. I'm not going to talk about that one. When you click on a submit button for a form, the form data is sent to the server as part of the request. When you click the reset, it's set to its default. You know that already. It's up to you if you want to go, and you'll see this at the end of the chapter, if you want to go in and you want to actually add something so that you are checking to make sure that before you send this out to a server that your fields are valid. It's not going to automatically validate things unless you put in things like type equal email, required. There are some HTML, HTML5 things you can put on a form that will do some validation for you. But if you want to make sure that, for example, that a first name has only letters, you'd have to put that in yourself. And whether you think so or not, you know how to do that, because we've worked with regular expression patterns. You could check to make sure that A through Z, upper or lower case, were the only thing that you allowed, for example. All right. As it says, when the form is submitted, the data in the controls is sent along with the HTTP request. The difference between a get and a post, you already saw the get. What the post does is it takes the information, for lack of better words, it hides it in what are called headers that get sent along with the message. And it does that because it's harder for a user to get into those headers to grab that information than it is for them to see something that's just scrolling across the screen. All right? So as it says, when you use the get, The URL that requests the file is followed by the question mark, and again, that's the query string. The pairs contain the name attributes and the value for each thing that's submitted. When you do a post, the data is hidden. I don't think that's new. This is what this chapter is about. Data validation. As it says, it refers to checking the data collected on the form to make sure it's valid. It's always going to be done on the server side. I hope you understand this, that even something as simple as this, if I'm sending it out someplace, it's still going to validate it. What do I mean by that? Well, it is possible if you don't write validation code that I could come in into one of these text boxes here. I could type in malicious JavaScript. If I typed in malicious JavaScript, and instead of, like if I put in script tags and then put in some JavaScript, okay? What the system should do is it should take those script tags and it should change this. It should change this script tag to this. Ampersand LT script ampersand GT. If it does that, I'm not going to be able to execute the JavaScript. Does that make sense to you? Because it's no longer this. But if I put this in there and just put in something as an example, just something as simple as click here. And then I end the script tag. If I put that in for this field, let's say, and I run it and it comes up and it says click here, now I can put anything I want in there, including malicious stuff. Like I can go and say, click this link for something, and I can have that link go in. If I really know what I'm doing and I research it, for instance, I could remove everybody that was in their database. All right? And it's not as hard to do as you might think. That's one of the reasons that you do validation. People don't want to let malicious people come in and do things they're not supposed to do. And let's face it, good, bad, or indifferent, we live in a world where that's happening. There's a thing on the news yesterday about all these different COVID scams that are going on. It's sad, but it's true. All right. To save round trips to the server when the data is invalid, some validation is usually done on the client. All right. However, it doesn't have to be as thorough as what's done on the server. That may be true, that may not be true. You can validate everything on the client if you want to. But guess what? Even if you do and you send it over to the server, the first thing that happens on the server side is it revalidates everything. It might write a totally different program than the one you wrote. Because again, most of that information typically is going into a database someplace. You don't want to let bad data into a database and then worry about it. You want to stop it before it's got the chance to get in. Now that should make sense to everyone. All right. So here are some HTML controls for working on forms. I'm not going to run through these. These are a couple that you might want to go, and if you ever have any doubts, go out to that caniuse.com site. For instance, I don't know with the TEL, but for a long time this wasn't supported by some browsers. You know what that is, where you can click on it and basically it'll allow you to make a phone call type of an idea. All right. But email should make sense. URL means it expects it's going to start with either an HTTP : an HTTPS : or an FTP : And FTP almost is never done with something like that. All right. Telephone again for the telephone number. Notice gets a telephone number with no validation done by the browser. You can put garbage in there technically. All right. Number, when supported, gets a number entry, numeric, with min and max and step attributes. The step is always 1 by default. The bad thing about setting a field as a number field, if you've never noticed this, I can do that, for instance, like the test scores program that we've done. I could go and put it in a number field, and I could set the minimum to 0 and the maximum to 100. Okay? The problem is I can still manually go in there and type in any number I want. All that means is if I use it, because it gives you a little up and down arrow, that means that the only things that's going to hold is 0 through 100 if you do it like that. All right. Date, as it says, typically gives you a pop-up calendar. All right. Maybe you've seen this before, like, for instance, if I want to go and try to make an appointment with my dentist, All right, that kind of thing. They'll typically, they'll say, well, schedule this. And they're able to show you the days and the times that are available, etc. All right. Time, as it says, gets a time entry. Autofocus sets the focus on a field when the page is loaded. You should only do this once. That should make sense to you. You can only have one at the beginning. Quite often, it's the first field that's in there. Doesn't have to be, but usually it seems to be. That's where you want to start anyway. And the placeholder, I don't think we have to talk about that anymore. We all know what a placeholder is, right? All right. So here they've got type equal email and type equal tell. And notice they are starting with the autofocus here. Now, you don't usually get a message like this that says, please include this in the email address. This is missing that. You don't get that much detail, not that I've seen. It'll just usually say something like it was, illegally formed or whatever. All right. So as it says, many HTML5 input controls provide for basic data validation. So bottom line is this. There's probably at least 4 different ways to validate. One, technically, is to do no validation at all. I call it the ostrich method, where you stick your head in the sand and hope that whoever is putting in the information knows what the heck they're doing. That's probably the worst way to do it. The second is what we just are talking about here, is just using HTML5 and what's available there. Okay, that's better, but there's still ways of getting around that. The next is to use pure JavaScript. All right, the problem with using pure JavaScript is the user can come in. I can come in here, and I can go up to my controls in Chrome right there, and I can turn JavaScript off. So if you do that, it's not going to help too much. And what we're getting to in here is, in addition to just straight JavaScript, you can combine jQuery with it. All right? And there's even another way that we're going to talk about in just a couple minutes. All right. So here's some attributes for data validation. You know what required is already. I'm not going to talk about that. Notice there's a title. Text that is displayed as a tooltip when the mouse hovers over a field. You can put that in. Now, quite often when, the only time you really should use that is if you're asking for a field and it's possible the user doesn't know what it is. In other words, I would not put a title over a field that's called first name that has a label already on it that says first name and a placeholder that says enter your first name here, because that's kind of overkill. All right. You can use regular expression patterns. You can use them right in your HTML. They're not nearly as slick. They don't, in my opinion, they don't work as well as when you put them in the JavaScript, but you can use them. All right, no validate. Notice what it says. It's a Boolean attribute, which means it's true or false, right? That tells the browser it shouldn't validate the form or the control that it is coded for. All right. The last one is actually the most important. The autocomplete. Have you ever, maybe you did this when you were taking the test. Autocomplete is typically on by default. So once you start filling in stuff, it's going to automatically remember what you did. The only thing it doesn't automatically remember is things like password. It won't do that. And you may have noticed that when we had the email and the confirm email, it didn't put it in there either. All right. So as it says, set this attribute to off to tell the browser to disable auto-completion. You can do it for the entire form, or you can do it on a control-by-control basis. So notice here they've come in and they have added a pattern right there for the phone number. All right. And it's not really very different than what we looked at. This is what you will typically get. Please match the requested format. All right, this must be 999, etc. That's a time where that title attribute might not be a bad thing to have. So as it says, 2 reasons why you need JavaScript. Number 1, the HTML5 input controls and attributes aren't implemented by all current browsers. This is a 2019 book. I think you'll find if you look that virtually every modern browser does implement these controls. All right. Second, HTML5 is limited in the types of validation it can do. For instance, it can't check whether a field is equal to another one, like the email and the confirm email, password and confirm password, or look up a state in a table. All right. As of this writing, as it says, Chrome, IE, Edge, Firefox, and Opera all support all of these attributes. Even so, you typically need to use JavaScript and jQuery to do an adequate job. All right, so the rest of the chapter starting here on 296 is how to use jQuery. So let's look at this. There'll be a table in just a minute. As it says, the first table summarizes the jQuery selectors you can use with forms. It says, as you can see, these selectors make it easy. Again, relative term. All right, it's easy once you've done it for a while. All right. The second table summarizes the val methods that you are already familiar with. Val, like we used to use value back when we were using the document.getElementById, etc. The third table summarizes the trim method. It says which is one of the miscellaneous jQuery methods. It says it's useful because JavaScript does not provide its own trim method. I think that's a lie. And the reason I'm saying that is I come in here and type in I'm going to type in here W3 schools JavaScript trim method. It's going to find it, and it's going to show it right here. So there it is. str, notice, again, trim is designed to get rid of leading spaces and trailing spaces. All right, and you call it like this. I think that it exists. There is also an L trim and an R trim. L trim removes leading spaces, R trim removes trailing spaces. Really what trim is it's a combination of, they put together L trim and R trim. Does that make sense? And I've said this to you before, but I'm going to say it again. The reason that they had to invent things like this is what people used to do is if you had a form and they had required fields and if you didn't want to put something in, people would just hit the space bar once or twice. Now you can't do that. All right? So you can see all of these. Now the good news is virtually everything that's in here we've talked about at one time or another this semester. So you can read this. All right? So the jQuery methods for getting and setting, we already talked about this, right? Val, paren, val, value. Anytime you see the empty parens, it's a getter. When there's something in the parens, it's a setter. So this is called an accessor. It means I'm grabbing the value. Hey, what's your name? You can't tell me your name. That's a getter. No, I've already got 2 Gabriels in here. From now on, you're just Gabe. All right? That's a setter. All right? And they, as always, they give you plenty of examples on how you can get and set this stuff. So as it says, jQuery provides special selectors for selecting the controls on the form. The val method is used for getting and setting, and the trim for trimming and entry. I don't think there's anything in there we haven't talked about. The event methods for a form, again, I want to make sure that everybody who's in this room agrees with me that you all understand what a focus event is, correct? You all understand what a blur event is, correct? When you've got fields where you are inputting something, like a text box or whatever, there's change. So every time you key in something, it is a new change event. All right? Select, as it says, if you select the text in a text box or in a text area. Submit when you click the submit button. So notice every one of these has an associated jQuery method for triggering events. So again, if you were asked to write a program that you had some kind of an opening screen that asked you for information, and you didn't supply that information and somebody pressed submit, you could keep them from leaving that screen. Does that all make sense? So notice again, some code examples. A handler that disables or enables radio buttons. All right. Again, if checked, set it to false. Otherwise, set it to true. And it's the disabled property. All right. So setting disabled to false is the same thing as enabling something. Setting disabled to true is disabling something. Does that make sense? All right. So here's, as it says, here's a handler that triggers the submit event after some validation. In this case, as they're mentioning right here, this join list is not a submit button. It is just a button. What's the difference? You've got more control if you make something a regular button than you do over making it a submit button. All right? More programmatic control. All right. So as it says, you can use these event handlers and select events to process data as the user works with individual controls. We're going to see it in just a minute. You can use an event handler for the click event on a regular button, but not on the submit. You can also use an event handler for the submit to validate the data before it's sent to the server. If it's invalid, again, that prevent default that we've already talked about. All right. So the last thing that's discussed in this chapter for the last 3 or 4 pages, as it says, is a validation application that uses JavaScript. I would recommend that you take some time and look at this before your test next week so you have an idea of how it works. All right. It says, jQuery makes it easy to access the user entries and display error messages. We're doing a lot of the same validation we've done previously, but now we are implementing it using jQuery. All right. So, as it says, the figure 10.6 shows you this is the input. Probably the most complex form that we've looked at this semester. It's got 3 different areas in it. This technically isn't, this has nothing, this isn't the form, that's just a heading that they put in there. So there's a registration information area, there's a member information area, there is a submit your membership area. So there are 3 areas that are in there. All right. Again, notice the form has an ID. What else does? The password field has an ID. The email field has an ID. Virtually everything that's in here that you might want to check or be able to have some programmatic control over has an ID. All right. Now notice it says here, some of the JavaScript for the application. As these programs get more and more complex, they will require more and more code. So if you've got a fairly complex form where you're asking for 20 pieces of information, you could potentially have at least a couple hundred lines of code. Depending on who you were in this class, some of you wrote pretty long programs, all right, for the last test that we took. Your JavaScript was a couple hundred lines or more long. Notice to select the 2 radio buttons, the change event handler uses the :radio selector. This works because the form contains only 1 group of radio buttons. If there were more than 1 group, you would need to code an attribute selector similar. You'd have to do it in more detail, in other words. So look at what we've got in here. All right. If there's a change in the radio button, you're checking it here. All right. Here's what you're checking in the submit event. This is all what they're doing is they're combining the stuff we've already talked about in the chapter together. All right. And again, I'm going to show you yet another way to do this in just a couple of minutes. There's the preventing the submission. Anytime they're using the double equals, they really should be triple equals. We've talked about that before. All right. That's it for the chapter. It's 9:30. Let's come back at 9:45. And I'm going to show you something, and then we're going to go through chapter 11. We should be done hopefully somewhere around 10:30, okay, 10:45. All right.